Good morning, everyone, and welcome to X Church at Home. I'm sad that we can't be together physically today, but I'm excited that we can still gather virtually. I hope you're enjoying this Memorial Day weekend with friends and family. I know that I am. Today, what I want to do is take just a couple minutes to look at a classic Bible story from the Old Testament, or the first half of our Bibles, in 1 Samuel chapter 17, about a guy named David and a guy named Goliath. We're just going to read through section by section, and then I'm going to share with you some thoughts and things that we can learn and then apply to our own lives as we seek to experience God's love and extend it to those around us. You with me? Here we go. Let's pick up this story in verse 3 of chapter 17. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley in between them. Okay, pause. So there were the Israelites, which was God's chosen people, and then there were the Philistines, their enemies, and they were in a battle. They were engaged in a war, and here's what it says in verse 4. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. So you might be wondering, okay, how tall is that in today's speak? Well, some scholars believe that that would have meant he was 6'9", which may not seem tall to you today, but keep in mind that back then and in that part of the world, the average height of a man would have been 5'5". That's right. So I would have actually been considered average height. Yay. So this dude was a big guy. Let's keep reading. Verse 5. And he had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." So he's saying to them, aren't you servants of Saul? Saul was the king. He was in charge of Israel at this time. Now, I picture Goliath kind of being like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, but not as friendly, like minus the smile. So this was a no-nonsense warrior type guy, and he is coming against the people of God. So that's the context. Let's keep reading verse 19. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper and took the provisions and went, as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle, shouting the war cry. So here he is in the middle of the battle. I want to pause for just a second and give my first observation. See, David was the youngest, okay? He much rather would have been in the battle, I imagine. He much rather would have been there fighting this war. But instead, he had a job to do. He had a job to honor his father and to help take care of the sheep and to bring this food to his older brothers. And if you know the end of the story, spoiler alert, he finds himself in the middle of this battle against Goliath. And guess what? He wins. But I want to make this statement. Are you ready? If you're taking notes today, write this down. David's commitment to his current assignment granted his greatest achievement. Let me say that one more time. David's commitment to his current assignment granted his greatest achievement. If he would not have honored the Lord by obeying his dad and being obedient to where God had currently placed him, he would then not have ended up where he needed to be at the right place at the right time with a big God to do a big task that we still talk about thousands of years later, which was fighting Goliath and winning. And so what I want you to hear today is that you might be doing something, you might be called to something that doesn't seem very exciting, right? And you might be thinking, this can't surely be what God has for me. But what if your faithfulness in that work will ultimately result in God doing something extraordinary in and through you. Look at what it says in Matthew 25:29. This is Jesus after he tells this story about talents or money or resources. He says, to those who use well what they are given, even more will be given, and they will have an abundance, it says. But from those who do nothing, even what little they have will be taken away. In other words, if you're faithful in the little, God will give you much. So he was faithful in doing what God had called him to do and obeyed his father and took care of the sheep and ran the errands. But then because of this obedience, he was in the right place at the right time, as we're going to read in just a minute. I remember struggling my freshman year with school. I didn't like it. But I was really committed to our traveling worship team that I was a part of, because I not only got to lead worship musically on campus, but also in surrounding churches in Michigan and beyond. And so that was really exciting to me. And because I put my focus and attention there, I ended up getting noticed by a professor and teacher at the college, who ultimately then offered me a job as a worship intern and then as a worship leader at a local church. At 17 years old, I was getting paid to serve the church and lead the church in the way that I felt called. And that was so wild. Like, who hires a 17-year-old to do that? But I believe that I was faithful in the little thing, and then God produced much through that, just like David, and same goes for you. All right, let's keep reading. We're going to pick it up in verse 22. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he walked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. And David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, so shall it be done to the man who kills him. Okay, let's pause there for just a second. Another observation is this: David wasn't motivated by the riches. David wasn't motivated by the riches. He was motivated by what was right. Everybody around him was saying, hey, whoever kills Goliath gets all this stuff. But that's not what David is concerned with. He turns around and says, I'm more concerned with the reproach that's been brought on Israel. I'm more concerned about the things he's saying about our God. This is wrong. Who's going to make it right? And if we can model this in our lives, I believe we'll have great success. In Matthew 6:33, Jesus says, seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. Or other translations say, and you will have everything you need. When we make what is right our priority, which is honoring God, loving him and loving others, and going and telling others about his love, when we prioritize the things of God, we will be blessed, but in different and better ways. And so that's another way that we can lean into this story and learn from David. Verse 28. Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, why have you come down, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. David ignored the insecurity of his accusers. David ignored the insecurity of his accusers. His brother Eliab, think about it, was just insecure. No, really. Here he had been on the battlefield, not able to go and face Goliath. He doesn't have the strength. He doesn't have the lack of fear or faith that David presumes to have. And so he feels embarrassed by his younger brother and the things he's saying. So what's he do? He begins to accuse. Well, you're not really here for the right reasons. Hey, you're not doing your job well. Who did you leave those sheep with? Dad would be disappointed. You're evil. Your intentions must be wrong. Why does he do this? To cover his own grief, to cover his own insecurity and problems. Listen, I'm not perfect, but I have been in environments where I have worked with leaders who have belittled me, who have said things like this to me, questioning my motivation, questioning my heart. Why? Because at the root of it, there's insecurity, and then they'll accuse you and try to sidetrack you. I promise you that the enemy does this. He is the father of lies, Jesus says in John chapter 8, and he wants you to believe that you are wrong, that your heart is not in the right place. He wants you to believe that God can't use you and isn't interested in using you, that your story is already written and that it's already over. But I promise you it's not. And when you can identify this insecurity in your accusers, talk about insecure, the devil already knows that he's going to lose. He is in a losing fight with Jesus Christ and with us by extension. So he's going to do everything he can to throw darts. But don't just take my word for it. Look at what it says in 1 John chapter 3, beginning in verse 11. This is the message you have heard from the beginning. We should love one another. We must not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and killed his brother. So he's going back to this story in Genesis about two brothers, Cain and Abel. And he says, and why did he kill him? Because Cain had been doing what was evil, and his brother had been doing what is righteous. He felt guilty that he was doing the wrong thing, but his brother was doing the right thing. Sound familiar? I've been there before. And so then it says this, so don't be surprised, dear brothers and sisters, when the world hates you. Don't be surprised when that person hates you because you're trying to honor God and God is blessing you for it and he's giving you the courage to move forward in faith. You just turn away as David did, and you keep fighting. I'm so thankful that I've had people in my life who have said, hey, turn away from that, don't listen to that, and you keep fighting. Okay, at this point in the story, David is now going to go to King Saul and attempt to get this job done. He wants to show him that he's the man for the job. Let's pick it up in verse 34. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear, and they took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. See, David valued both training and trusting. What do I mean by that? He understood that in life, yes, ultimately, he said, the Lord is the one who's going to deliver me, but I've been training for this moment. Remember, your current assignment, if you are dedicated to it, could result in your greatest achievement. So do the work. Paul tells that to his young Padawan in the faith, Timothy. He says, do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, or a worker who is approved, right? He says you need to work hard, be diligent in the things that God has called you to do. And in doing that, then when the time is right, your training plus your trusting will result in your triumph. So he says, I'm ready to go. God has been preparing me for this. I can look back at all these different moments in my life where God was actually prepping me for the next assignment. And the same is true for you. All right, this is where things get fun. Verse 38. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not yet tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in the shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. I love this because David embraced his who and his how. What do I mean by that? It's not that armor is bad or that swords are bad, but that wasn't his thing. God had gifted him and made him special, and he knew how he was going to defeat this enemy, and it wasn't through those common means. It wasn't through those basic means. In other words, he had to embrace who God had made him to be and to do it in the way that God had equipped him to do it. It's not that those things are bad, but they're just not who he was in that moment in time. And this is consistent with what I've been talking about for several weeks now in Ephesians 4:16, where it says you've got a special work that only you can do. It's accomplished through your unique personality, natural abilities, and God-given gifts. And so what are those? What is your who? What is your how? Look, I'm going to be honest. I feel tribalist sometimes. What do I mean by that? Well, in the church planting sphere, there are all these different camps. There are all these different ideologies, theological positions, and methodologies. And typically you will kind of align yourself with a group of guys or people that think and plant and do ministry the same way. But I'm going to be honest, I don't fit. And sometimes that's made me feel very isolated because I might preach like one group, but we might worship and do church like another group. And so I think people make a lot of assumptions about us by the way we look or operate, but we're really different on the inside. And so what I've learned is God has made Alex to be Alex, and I don't need to copy other pastors. I don't need to copy other churches. I need to do what God has made me to do and to do it well, just like David did. And the same is true for you, right? That is so important for us to grasp as we're walking through this story of David. There are so many parallels that we can take out of this for ourselves. And so don't believe that lie that you've got to fit the paradigm and be like everybody else, be who God made you to be, and to go in obedience. All right, let's finish this story up. What do you say? Verse 41. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with the sword and not with the spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give me or give you into my hand. All right, things are about to heat up. Let's finish this story. What do you say? Verse 41, and the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. Bonus observation: trash talking is sometimes acceptable. Okay, moving on. Let's finish this out. And when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Also, isn't it interesting that they conveniently omitted the part where David chops Goliath's head off in most children's Bibles? Like, where was that when I was growing up? Probably because illustrating it would have been too graphic. Anyways, what's this mean for you and me? God's called you to something. Go do it and learn from David. Am I right? Let's pray. God, thank you for X Church. I pray that this time was fruitful. I pray that we would not just be hearers of your word only, so deceiving ourselves, but we would be doers who act and be blessed in our doing. Help us to do big things for you. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks so much. I hope that you've experienced God's love together this morning. Now go and extend it. I'll see you in person next time.